For some, the typical farm looks similar to this, endless monocultures. However, for the farmers of Albert Lea, the only thing that breaks the sea of grain is the occasional drainage ditch that allows for their participation within a global food chain. This has us asking, why do we farm and why do we drain?
The territory we've been studying is the Shell Rock River watershed that extends from the city of Albert Lea, Minnesota, and down through Iowa. Historically, the landscape was almost entirely prairieland, with large wetlands around the headwaters of the river. Our area of interest has been on this northernmost portion. The wetlands that existed in the area were a vast feature of the landscape. In the early 1900s, settlers began filling the newly gridded territory with cropland, redefining the landscape. However, saturated soils proved to be a challenge for farmers, as monocultures like corn and soy could not survive the high water table. To combat this, farmers established extensive artificial drainage networks. This drainage had a huge impact on the landscape and led to the removal of many wetlands that existed on farmland. But today, the evidence of them is still visible. This form of drainage not only removes water from the soil, but also transfers pollutants from fertilizers and pesticides off of farms and dumps them into local waters. The hydrology of the area has been physically altered by these drains, creating a network of smaller watersheds within the larger territory. All of this extensive modification to the land is required for a global food chain to operate, in which farmers collectively export corn from the territory to feed livestock elsewhere.
We see the local scale as a point for intervention to reimagine the way in which industrialized agriculture is embedded within the territory, starting at the scale of a small group of farmers. Currently, these farmers share a drainage system that forms a connection between them not visible to the naked eye, and we've defined this relationship as a watershed. Collectively, these farmers pay into the shared drainage system through property taxes and communication with the ditch authority. Each of these farmers requires the drains to grow. As a result, heavy pollution from fertilizers and pesticides are also flowing through drains and crossing property lines on their way back to the Shell Rock River. The crop they produce is not for local consumption, rather the agriculture is feeding into a global food chain that may not see a return in the area. To address pollution, we propose the addition of wetlands along existing drainage routes to capture runoff. By paying farmers through Minnesota CREP, we can incentivize the transition by reimbursing them for the cropland lost. While the wetlands help to slow down the runoff traveling across properties, it doesn't address the source of the pollution, reliance on fertilizers and pesticides due to monoculture farming. By subsidizing polycultures, farmers will still produce corn. However, the addition of sister crops can absorb lost nutrients and help control pests, weeds, and disease without major chemical usage. Small pockets of polycultures may not have a market on their own. By organizing farming into a co-op selling system, we can incentivize the benefits of variety while still making it profitable and worthwhile for farmers to invest in. Increases in CREP could continue to grow wetlands, and potentially having a wetland on your property could be a more reliable source of income rather than using that land for monocultures. The wetland can also become a place for farming. With the planting of native wild rice and other water-living crops, a local food network could emerge. By using the same co-op system already introduced with the incorporation of polycultures, wild rice could have a local market in Albert Lea.
This intervention isn't something that can happen all at once. Starting with what's existing, we can watch one farm transform over time, starting with simple drainage upgrades that widen the path and introduce wild plantings. As farms transition from monocultures to polycultures, the drainage path continues to widen into a wetland that provides new opportunities for farming, as well as restoring habitats for wildlife that were previously replaced by industrial cropland. On the ground, wetlands cut through the land that once belonged to towering corn, creating marshy ecosystems that break up the landscape and reestablish wildlife and vegetative habitat in Albert Lea. Farmers that had once organized themselves off of linear drainage systems, valuing personal property and global production, are now organized around a local context to the land, becoming stakeholders in a series of shared wetlands. Farmers who choose to invest in this system can take part in a regional food network, sharing the tools and resources needed to grow variety and cooperatively producing for their local communities. This network is able to be scaled across the watershed to any terrain that can support wetlands and polycultures. Where this intervention reaches, Albert Lea is no longer defined by a grid, but by natural boundaries shared amongst farmers.
By looking at what exists, we began to address our initial questions about today's practices of farming and drainage. Looking towards a collective drainage system rather than a sporadic one, we can rethink the way farms operate on a local level. Through the utilization of the government subsidizing polycultures, we can see a change in the farming status quo. Corn can still be fed into a global system, but in establishing regional markets and incorporating variety, we can address the much-needed shift from a global food system to a local one. It's not a matter of a singular design solution, but rather a continual investment in thinking about and engaging with farming communities. This intervention has direct impacts on the way in which the land is reshaped over time, beginning to look more and more like the land that existed pre-settlement, but thinking about the future of farming operations through a post-industrial lens. While this proposal is tied to Albert Lea, the way in which farms operate is similar across the entire Midwest. While not all areas can support this wetland development, it's worth rethinking the way an investment in farming can help support their territories through food. We leave you with this. While the territory isn't something that exists now, it's something you can experience through food. Eating the future foods of Albert Lea can give you a taste of what's in store for the future of farming.